Kings in Comparative Literature and English, and I'm also one of the conveners of the Postcolonial Research Network. We're very excited today. We've been talking about this for years now, but this is the first joint research seminar of the Menzies Center and the Postcolonial Research Network. So thanks very much to Menzies Center people for making this possible. Before we get started, I wanted to introduce today's speaker, who bridges the interests of these two groups really beautifully. This is Dr. Jemana Baya, who's coming to us from Macquarie today. She's an early career fellow there. She's held fellowships at the University of Edinburgh, University of Copenhagen, and the Lebanese American University in Beirut. She is the author of this excellent book, The Literature of the Lebanese Diaspora, Representations of Place and Transnational Identity, which is brand new from Ivy Tourist 2015. Go read it. And she's also written more widely on Arab diaspora writing in general.
I'll just say a few words. My name is Sheridan Humphreys. I'm the Postgraduate Events Administrator for the Menzies Centre, and we're delighted to be hosting our first joint seminar with you guys. I'm sure there's plenty of crossover in our upcoming seminars, and if you'd like to join our mailing list, I'll have a list, a sign-in sheet at the end. It's lovely to see all of you here, and very, very pleased to welcome our speaker. And
I forgot the other thing to say.
Oh, what's that?
This is particularly for Menzies Center people, but also for others, that Janelle is wearing all Australian designers today.
All Australian designers.
Including Scannon and Theodore.
Yes, the most important.
Yes.
Scannon and Theodore, Sass and Bede, and Fleur Ward. So Australian designers on show as well. And we might put some links to that on the Menzies Centre Facebook page if you're interested.
And I'll almost say unashamedly on purpose I did that, but I guess that will undermine my academic credentials if I admitted it 100%, but you heard it here, and if you quote me I'll deny it, although it's being recorded. Thank you, Anna, and thank you, Sheridan, and thank you to the Menzies Centre and the Postcolonial Network for allowing this to happen today. My talk, as you might guess from the abstract, is divided into two parts. I hope it's seamless, but you'll notice that the first part of the talk, I give an overview of what it means to teach Middle East studies in Australia, and then I move on to a discussion of not an Australian writer or an Australian Arab writer, but the work of a woman who's based here in the UK, part of the year. Her name is Abdul Slave. She's written a couple of novels and various, she writes for The Guardian as well, and I'm using her work as a way to demonstrate something about what it means for me, what my experience is as studying Middle East studies in Australia and teaching Middle East studies in Australia, what that has brought to my research practice and vision for thinking about the region and teaching the region. So anyway, to begin with the first part, teaching Middle East studies in Australia. So, like most universities around the world, many in Australia teach Middle East studies, of course. While the Middle East might seem to be very far away from Australia, Southeast Asia is much closer, Australia's interest in the region is not to be underestimated. This year, 2015, for instance, marks a century of Australian involvement in wars in the Middle East region. It started with the Gallipoli Offensive, which is very important in sort of Australian national culture, and continues with our participation in the current war against the Islamic State, or ISIS, or various other forms that entity seems to take. Our leader at the time, in 2003, fell over himself in his efforts to offer Australia's services for the 2003 Iraq War, despite the war's wide unpopularity domestically, and also the international sort of legitimacy that it had. Prime Minister Howard wanted to go, and so we did. This involvement is, I think, something quite remarkable for a country so on the periphery of the Middle East, and also lacking in its power to influence the West foreign policy agenda in the region. So we have little capacity to demand from the UK and the US, our main allies, that they should change their foreign policy approach. We accept their foreign policy approach and go along with it. What is surprising, however, is the little diversity of teaching on the Middle East that is evident in Australian universities. Teaching the Middle East in Australia ranges from offering Middle East-related units, which is the predominant practice, to less common Middle East studies programs. Middle East studies programs, broadly defined, are found really, I think, mainly in two universities in Australia, the ANU, or the Australian National University, based in Canberra, and the University of Sydney. The most comprehensive, I think, is the ANU, and in its Centre for Arab and Islamic Studies. It offers both a full bachelor and a major in Middle Eastern and Central Asian studies. While the unit offerings at undergraduate level are indeed diverse, you can take majors in 3 of the main languages of the Middle East, Arabic, Turkish and Persian. There are subjects on Iranian art and literature, history of the Middle East, and so on. It is politics, international relations and political economy, what one could broadly call geopolitical approaches to the Middle East, that tend to dominate there. The University of Sydney's Department of Arabic Language and Cultures is a little bit different to the ANU. As its title suggests, the department teaches the Arabic language only. It also has units that focus on cultural production, like art, film and literature, history of the Middle East, and also what I would call issues of interest units, like, on topics like bathing, for instance. In other universities across the state, Middle East units, if they feature at all, do so in politics and international relations departments, or mainly, I think, as a result of the post-9/11 environment we live in newly established centres or institutes that focus on security studies. In my own university, Macquarie in Sydney, there is a large centre known as PICT, Policing, Intelligence and Counter-Terrorism. It was founded originally to provide master's degrees to those who worked in intelligence agencies or special units of counter-terrorism, mainly based in Australia's capital territory in Canberra. PICT has expanded its purview since then, but I think at its core still lies this idea that the biggest security threat to Australia and the West is coming from Islam, the Middle East and Arabs, categories that it sometimes likes to collapse in an unproblematic way. Alongside security studies approaches, Islamic studies also seems to be another ever-growing popular way of looking at the Middle East in Australia. The ANU Centre's name, Arab and Islamic Studies, is a register of this, and ANU of course doesn't embrace Islamic studies in an uncritical manner, but it's still very much part of what it does. Again, Islamic studies seems to take on a politics flavour, and in its more troubling manifestation is used to explain why, religiously and culturally, the Middle East is the way that it is. There are also some Middle East-related units taught in the social sciences in departments like anthropology and sociology, but these are limited to 1 or 2 and have not in themselves been able to disrupt what is undoubtedly the predominance of political studies language in teaching the Middle East in the Australian Academy. Obviously, because of this dominance, the field I do most of my research in, which is Middle Eastern literature, is almost always never taught. Not in Middle East-related subjects, not in Middle East studies programs, or even in literature departments. At the ANU and the University of Sydney, there are, as I noted earlier, some units dedicated to literature, but these have taken the form of language-intensive units that is, reading texts in Arabic, Persian or Turkish, and honing, developing the skill of acquiring a foreign language, which is, a great skill to have. But that's the main focus of Arabic literature or Middle Eastern literature. In other words, the texts that are read not as a way to demonstrate the value of literary studies, as another lens through which to make sense of the Middle East. In literature departments, where literature in languages other than English is taught, and it mainly happens as part of postcolonial sort of subjects, postcolonial literature subjects, Middle Eastern literatures are largely underrepresented. There are 2 broad reasons for this, I think. The first is that the Middle East doesn't easily fit into a postcolonial frame. European colonialism, and especially the British variety, was not as pronounced or prolonged in the Middle East as in places like India or some countries in Africa. The Ottoman Empire remained in place until roughly 1919, thereby minimising the impact, if not on encroachment, on European encroachment into the region, but then at least on prolonged forms of European settlement. Do countries like Lebanon and Syria, for instance, easily fit into a post-colonial frame in the way that you would think of India as being a post-colonial state? And I think not. Of course, there are some exceptions. The British certainly left their mark, if not, if they, not necessarily because they were there for a long time, but they certainly left their mark on places like Egypt and Palestine. And, we also have the Algerian experience with the French. So, those are, I think, are exceptions. But even in these instances, you would be hard-pressed to find a text by, say, the Egyptian feminist Nawal Saadawi or the Palestinian poet Mahmoud Darwish on a post-colonial literature course in Australia. The second reason as to why Middle Eastern literatures are underrepresented probably has something to do with the centrality of Anglophone literatures within post-colonial studies in the Australian system. Post-colonialism in literary studies was preceded by Commonwealth studies pioneered by 3 Australians, Gil Ashcroft, Gareth Griffiths and Helen Tiffin. Namely, I think in that sort of groundbreaking book, The Empire Writes Back, Commonwealth studies aimed to make a case for literatures written outside of the UK, in former British colonies. And these literatures included countries, works from places like Australia, Canada, parts of Africa, South Asia, Malta, and even the United States. Even though we have evolved beyond this, and we really talk about post-colonial literatures or post-colonial studies today, the Anglophone legacy seems to really loom large in Australia. Even Egyptian and Palestinian literature, states which have, as I argued earlier, some history of British colonial rule, do not make their way into the post-colonial literary scene in Australia easily enough. And this is because Egyptian and Palestinian writers rarely compose their texts in English. They write generally in Arabic. They could be read in translation, but there is also a reluctance to do so, a reluctance that I think extends far beyond just Australia. But the funny thing about Australia is that you're not compelled to learn another language. So we have a very interesting relationship with literatures in translation. What this means is that works by, for instance, a Nobel laureate like Najib Mahfouz, the very famous Egyptian writer, get overlooked in post-colonial literary courses in Australia. The Middle Eastern writers who do compose their works in English generally do not reside in the region, but rather have settled in the English-speaking West. I refer to these authors as Arab or Middle Eastern diaspora writers, whose works share many affinities with post-colonial fiction, but not always, not perfectly. Diaspora fiction or literatures of migration are, I am learning, proving difficult to classify. Post-colonial studies doesn't really know how to treat them. Middle East studies with its obsession with geopolitics does not see them of much value. And Arabic studies departments are equally disinterested because these works are not in Arabic. Given what I feel is a litany of rejection, which I don't take personally, of course, and the general feeling in Australia that literature has nothing to offer Middle East studies, I have rebelled and introduced literature in my undergraduate courses on Middle East politics and international relations with the Middle East. Those are the 2 main courses I teach. To start, I started simply by reading excerpts from novels during the lecture. Students responded well to this. I could actually see them leaning forward in the lecture theatre to, listen. And as a result of that kind of engagement, I set sections of novels as part of students' weekly readings on odd weeks. I did note, though, that what students were mainly engaging with was the story and trying to fit the story's events that they were reading with the facts of, real-life facts. Despite the enjoyment, or perhaps because of it, literature was seen as ornamental to the serious study of the Middle East. I have since tried to challenge students further by asking them to think about how literature and politics are enmeshed, how literature can illuminate something about the Middle East that traditional political approaches sometimes tend to miss. Now, this is a question I have been asking myself during all of my training in Middle East politics and in my literary studies training. But as no one has really taught me Middle Eastern literatures in English, I've had to come up with a lot of these connections myself, which is, not a bad thing. Now, while this has been very difficult, doing so has allowed me to develop a kind of interdisciplinary framework, but most importantly, it has also allowed me to complicate the dominance of geopolitical and international relations-based language that is often used to explain the Middle East. The following paper, the second part of the paper, I think, is a result of that thinking process. It looks at the events of the so-called Arab Spring, focusing primarily on Egypt, and the initial hype over digital technology, and I'm of course talking about the 2011 revolution. So most assessments of the Arab Spring, including those from practitioners of politics and international relations, tended to attribute a great deal of significance to digital technology at the time, or more specifically, to new social media like Facebook, YouTube and Twitter. This is acutely exemplified in the way the first two revolutions in Tunisia and Egypt were labelled respectively as the Twitter revolution and then the Facebook revolution. I will be focusing on the Egyptian case, but will draw attention to the function of new social media in this context and beyond. Now, according to numerous news reports and academic articles on the uprisings, new media had two roles. It gave structure to the revolution, and it overcame harsh censorship measures. The second of these 2 points is more specific to the Egyptian case, while the first is broad and applies to most of those Arab uprisings. I'll begin with the general point and then I'll go into narrow my focus onto Egypt. It has been widely noted that the uprisings in Egypt, in Tunisia, in the earlier parts of the Syrian uprising and in the Libyan uprising, it was widely noted that they were leaderless. They were not led by any one party or person, nor were they facilitated by some military avant-garde in any Arab country. In response to this, some of the more extreme and I would say narrow assessments of the uprisings suggested that the leadership of these revolutions was media technology. 2 studies at the time confirmed this. The first, called the Arab Social Media Report, was released in June 2011 by the Dubai School of Government. The report engages in extensive data analysis and confirms the conventional wisdom that Facebook and Twitter enabled the revolutions. The report states that social media played the critical role in mobilisation, in empowerment, and shaping opinions and influencing change. A second, more measured study conducted by a professor of communication at the University of Washington, a man called Philip Howard, argues that social media altered the capacity of Arab citizens to affect domestic politics. It did this by allowing online activists to create a virtual media ecology of civil society. Further to this, Howard observes that social discontent is not something ready-made, but must gestate as people come to agree on the goals of their discontent. In the last few years, he argued, this gestation process has gone forward via new media and via a virtual media ecology. It is in this sense that digital media became the leader of the revolution in Howard's analysis, and what it did was help to transform individualised, localised and community-specific dissent into a cohesive and structured movement. The second and interrelated role that has been attributed to media technology is that it overcame state-enforced censorship. This observation, as I stated earlier, has been stressed mostly in reference to Egypt. And this is perhaps because when it came to the control of the media, print and TV, the Egyptian state, since the 1952 Nasser Revolution, has always interfered in overt and covert ways with political and moral content. State-run media was always closely affiliated with the regime and was generally seen as a voice box. This system remained intact during the presidencies of Nasser, Sadat, and especially under Mubarak, and we can also say it's back intact, today, under this current regime. Under Mubarak, all forms of opposition were heavily monitored. Publications by opposition figures were subject to intense scrutiny. Members of trade unions, secular political groups, and religious political groups that spoke out against Mubarak's rule were routinely harassed by the state security forces, arrested and beaten, sometimes even killed. In this environment of such pervasive censorship, new social media was seen to circumvent the restrictions imposed by the state. This is why, as Howard reports, that while there are many ways to tell the story of political change, in the Egyptian narrative, it was the internet, Facebook and Twitter that made the difference in ousting Mubarak. And the difference it made was that it gave civil society leaders the means or the tools to organise the resistance. There are many problems with the assumptions that underpin these ideas that social media gave structure to the revolution and was the only form of resistance possible. For some reason, the cheerleaders of social media seem to forget that the control exerted over traditional forms of media can be exerted also over newer forms. In Egypt, the Mubarak regime was able to slow down or cut off internet supply. It also had the capacity to identify some of the virtual warriors and arrest them. Where El-Ghanim, Google's top executive in the region and the hero of the Egyptian uprisings in 2011, was one of its many victims. In fact, well before the uprising began, the regime had been monitoring online political activity. So as we all know, any kind of digital technology is not a censorship-free zone. Another problem with the elevation of digital media to the level of leader is that it denies agency to Arab citizens who actually enacted these revolutions. It is not surprising that then that some people who participated in the uprisings rejected the supposed central role of new media. This is exemplified by the language that they used during the uprisings. In Egypt, the two dominant phrases that protesters cried out in Tahrir Square were Al-Sha'ab yurid isqat al-nizam, the people want to overthrow the regime, and Aish Hurriya Adala al-Ijtima'iyya, bread, freedom and social justice. And incidentally, that last series of words was used just a couple of days ago at the funeral of the woman who was killed, whose name escapes me at the moment. So those words, sorry?
Yeah.
So those words are finding their way back into Egypt. Now also, just a little bit on the translation of that phrase, the word in Egyptians use for bread is aish, which also means to live. So you could translate that phrase as something like to live with freedom and social justice. Now while these may seem as simple and catchy phrases, they nonetheless convey the agency of the Arabs in their own uprisings. And I think we tend to forget that, and I think we've especially tended to forget that because we feel that the revolution and the promise of that revolution has failed. I mean, I don't want to forget that, not yet anyway. These statements also identify which issues drove the Egyptians to rise up against that brutal leader. But the way that this agency and these issues are expressed, indeed the way that the resistance is expressed in language, are not the exclusive product of Facebook or Twitter. Indeed, the resistance that Arab populations displayed is built on something more than media technology. That something more is literature and is reflected, for instance, in the historical origins of that popular phrase, the people want or demand the overthrow of the regime. This slogan was adapted, according to Eliot Kohler, from the poem The Will to Live, written in 1933 by a Tunisian-born poet, Abu al-Qasim al-Shabi. The poem and its author achieved iconic status in Tunisia in the 1950s as part of the efforts to Arabize the country after decades of French colonial rule. For the Egyptians, the 40s and the 50s were equally marked by struggles against colonialism, and for this reason, the Tunisian poet's words resonated with the Arab nationalist aspirations of Nasser and his followers. The poem and its opening line, "If one day the people want to live, then fate will answer their call," are well known by many Arabs in the region. The appropriation of this poem in the Egyptian uprising demonstrates that literary texts form the basis of the deeper ideological saturation of the body politic that preceded by decades the dissemination of wall posts and videos on Facebook. Literature's temporal primacy exposes one reason why it needs to be examined. It shaped the language of the revolution. But a more important reason relates to the degree of autonomy that the Egyptian state extended to its writers and artists, as opposed to the censorship it exercised against the press. One of the ironies of the Egyptian ruling elite, since 1952 at least, up until Mubarak's fall, is that while it monitored and censored the media, it simultaneously allowed literary and artistic movements to develop with a certain degree of autonomy. Richard Jacquemont observes that this double standard contributed to the intense politicization of the literary field. Writers and artists employed a discourse taken from the political field within their literary texts. They exploited the greater freedom that existed in the cultural field to bring the struggles and debates that could not take place freely in the political arena. For many intellectuals and writers under Presidents Nasser and Mubarak, it waned a little bit under Sadat, but it was still there. Literature and literary criticism were not substitutes for political action, but forms of political action themselves. Examples of dissent and politically engaged Egyptian writers, poets and artists are abundant. The most famous is perhaps the Nobel laureate, who I mentioned earlier, Najib Mahfouz. He is credited with introducing the novelistic form to the Arab world, and his work has been compared to the likes of Dickens and Zola. While many have criticised his text as being too soft on the regime, and indeed he had to court ministers of culture in order to get his work, easily published, his novels, like the Cairo Trilogy or Children of the Alley, contain characters that are so impoverished that some are forced into prostitution and others resort to self-harm in order to collect money as beggars. Nawal Saadawi is another popular literary figure. As a secular feminist, she has occupied a critical position with regard to the Egyptian regime and the religious patriarchal structures that tend to endorse it. For her criticism of President Sadat's political and economic transformation of Egypt, she was arrested and imprisoned. Saadawi is trained as a medical doctor, but her novels, the most remarkable being Woman at Point Zero, and and her ficto-critical essays are, according to Julian Murfitt, the sure source to understanding the astonishing events in Egypt of February 2011. Ala al-Aswani, another Egyptian writer, was made famous by his widely celebrated novel, The Yaqubian Building. This novel has been described as a Mubarak-era text because of the way that it brings to life a seedy and despicable Cairo where only the corrupt can prosper. The actual building itself was constructed in 1934, and it was once home to a chic Cairene middle class. Since the 1970s, as the book describes, it is a rundown and has been abandoned by such a class. Its crumbling edifice acts as a metaphor for Cairo's own deterioration. Another author is Sonallah Ibrahim, supposedly most uncompromising of Egyptian writers. He is highly revered for his once relentless opposition to the ruling elite. His criticism reached an epic climax in 2003 when he refused, during what was meant to be his acceptance speech, the state-sponsored Arab Novel Award. In his speech, he highlighted the Egyptian government's contemptible treatment of its citizens and its baseless foreign policy. But what was worse for Ibrahim was the failure of the cultural field to act independently of the state and address its corrupt policies. He concluded by saying, "We have no theatre, no cinema, no research, no education. We have only festivals and conferences and a box full of lies. I publicly decline this prize because it is awarded by a government that lacks the credibility of bestowing it." And he left the theatre with all the dignitaries sitting behind him, and he was almost carried out by the crowd cheering for his words. Two contemporaries of Ibrahim, Sheikh Imam Isa, who is a composer and a singer, and Ahmed Fuad al-Nughm, a poet, also occupied the same relentless critical stance. In the 1970s, Imam and Nughm worked in collaboration with a former put music to the latter's political protest poems. This duo became the icon of political dissent in the 1970s, and Egyptian writers and artists continue to commemorate the death of Imam, and Nughm passed away only a couple of years ago as well. So, he's also been sort of become an important, an important figure in death, as he was in life, of course. All the writers and artists I have mentioned above reside in Egypt, but in this paper I also want to draw attention to the Arab diaspora writer. So what is the role of the diaspora writer in this context, and why is it any different to writers who remain in the homeland? There is a difference, I think, and diaspora writers play a unique role in the game of political dissent. And there are two ways that this role is reflected. The first and most obvious is that because diaspora writers dwell outside of the homeland, they are free from its censorship laws and practices. This may be true in certain places that have, much more, totalitarian system that, reaches into all aspects of public culture, not just the press, but also, theatre and novel and fiction, works of fiction. But that didn't happen in Egypt, as I've described. So in the case of Egypt, the need to go abroad in order to write texts that are critical of the state is not always essential. The writers I have just mentioned, like Mahfouz and Safdawi, demonstrate this. I think the second and more important contribution of diaspora writers is that they can communicate to their readers in the host country the forms of political dissent that already exist in the homeland. Diaspora writers are well poised to take on this role because they possess intimate knowledge of their homeland, its politics, its history and its culture. They are also able, as Ian Chambers points out in his work on the literature of migrant writers, to communicate and, if necessary, to translate the political, historical and cultural context of their homeland. In a country like Egypt, where Arabic is the national language, it is difficult for people to have no knowledge of Arabic, like many in the English-speaking world, to gain access to the literary and cultural forms of resistance that Egypt's history is defined by. What we need what Joseph Mas'ad calls cultural translators who straddle Arabic and English-speaking worlds to bring to light the tradition of resistance that defines Egyptian culture. One Egyptian-born writer who has been effective at doing this is the UK-based author Ahdaf Swaif. For those of you who I'm sure followed the events that unfolded in Tahrir Square, you may have already seen her newspaper articles. She's contributed to The Guardian and has at the time provided eyewitness reports as to what was taking place in Egypt during those 18 days of the revolution. Swaif, however, is not a journalist in my mind, she's a novelist. She certainly identifies as a writer of fiction, I think, more so than a news reporter. She's published 3 collections of short stories and, most recently, a memoir of Cairo and its revolution. Her most substantial contributions to fiction are, in my opinion, her two novels, In the Eye of the Sun, published in 1993, and The Map of Love, published in 1999. That novel was actually shortlisted for the Booker Prize in 1999 as well. Swafe's newspaper articles are important because they describe the revolution as it unfolded. Her novels, however, are invaluable to anyone trying to make deeper sense of the uprisings because they provide the trace, the events and the conditions for the revolution. This is reflected in a number of ways in her novels, but the two most prominent are Swafe's unique deployment of Arabic in an English language text and her focus on the cultural works of Arab artists that are not widely accessible to her Western readers. The following two examples that you have on the handout there demonstrate how Swafe conveys the resistance that is embedded in Egypt's literary history and also within the Arabic language. The first, example 1, is taken from In the Eye of the Sun and highlights the importance of translation in an intense manner. Here, the central character, Asi al-Ulama, attempts to explain to several English friends a piece by Sheikh Imam, but finds herself unable to do so with the mere translations of words. Sheikh Imam is, as I noted earlier, well known to all Egyptians and many Arabs. While he sings about the impact of America's policy on the Arab world, his words are unheard of in the West. The song begins, Sharafat ya Nixon Baba, Gabita al-Watergate. Now, as soon as Asya starts to translate, she finds herself having to describe the political and cultural setting, the multiple meanings of words, the signification of those meanings, and the impossibility of doing so without such, laboured explanations. You've honoured us, Nixon Baba. Baba means father, but it also is used, as it is used here, as a title of mock respect, as in Ali Baba. But the thing is, you could also address a child as Baba, as an endearment, a sort of inversion, like calling him Big Chief, because he is so little. And so when it is used aggressively, it carries a belittling signification. You've honoured us, Nixon, O you of Watergate. The next couplet, Amalulak Imi Wasimi, Salatin al-Ful was-Zayt, continues with this belittling of Nixon. Okay, well, Asya takes a deep breath. Imi is worth or value, so he says, they make an Imi for you. To make an Imi for someone is to behave toward them as though they have value, when they in fact have none. So, they've put on a show that gives you value. Simi is always used as an idiom with Ima, because of rhyme. It means appearance, so the appearance of a thing of value. This alone, I think, is scathing enough of Nixon, but Sheikh Imam's deepest criticism and ridicule is reserved for those who are giving Nixon the appearance of value. In this case, it is the Arab leaders. The second line of the couplet, Salatin al-Ful was-Zayt, expresses this. The sultans of Ful and the sultans of Zayt. Ful, that is one thing that everybody knows about Egypt, that Ful is the basic diet of Egyptians, particularly those from more traditional or poorer sectors of society. It is ground beans stewed for a very long time over a low fire. It is the cheapest food you can get, and so to be a sultan of Ful argues massive poverty and backwardness. This Ful can be dressed in various ways. The simplest and cheapest is with oil, zayt, and with lemon. So Ful and zayt come together. But zayt also, like oil in English, means petrol oil. So if you take that meaning, then there are two categories of sultan being referred to, the sultans of Ful and poverty, and the sultans of wealth and oil. Now this kind of translation, I think you get the gist, goes on in the novel for about six or seven more pages, revealing not just the complexity of the Arabic language and its culture, but also the overt and sophisticated forms of political resistance that dominated the cultural scene of Egypt during the 60s and 70s. Finally, I think this is the most poignant example, given the uprising that took place in Egypt in 2011, is Swafe's ability as a trained linguist to explain through her novels the intricacies of Arabic grammar. This example is taken from that second novel, The Map of Love, which interweaves plot lines from two Findo-Secular periods, the end of the 19th century, when Egyptians were fighting against British occupation, and also the end of the 20th century, where Egyptians were pushing against a new kind of imperialism, Western-imposed neoliberalism. In the following scene, the novel's American character, Isabel Parkman, is given a short Arabic lesson by her distant relative, the central character, Amal al-Khalidi. Amal explains that in the Arabic language, everything stems from a root, and the root is mostly made up of 3 consonants or 2. And then the word takes different forms. Take the root Kaf Lam Be, Kalb. qalb, the heart that beats, the heart of things. Then there are a set number of forms, a template almost, that any root can take. So in the case of qalb, you get qalab, to overturn, to overthrow, to turn upside down, making to the opposite, hence maqlab, a dirty trick, a turning of the tables, and also a rubbish dump. I like how she includes that. Maqlub, upside down, mutakalib, changeable, and finally inqilab, a coup. So at the heart of all things is the germ of their overthrow. The closer you are to the heart, the closer you are to the reversal. Nowhere to go but down. You reach the core, and then you're blown away. I don't think that there can be a more eloquent way to persuade or any writer to reclaim, even if in a disjointed or anachronistic sense, the Egyptian revolution that Asa Mubarak for the people. Despite what professors of communications and media schools were claiming, the revolution was always going to be instigated by the people because, I think as the Arabic language and Egyptian's cultural output reveal, political unrest is born and bred internally. Returning to my observations about the neglect in the Australian Academy of Middle Eastern Literatures in both Middle East Studies and Literature departments, I think the examples taken from Swaif's work highlight both the significance of narrative and its explicit as well as implicit relationship to Middle East politics. If we seek to understand the recent events in Egypt and indeed in the remainder of the Arab world, we won't get very far by simply examining the 140 odd characters that constitute a tweet or a text message, or the short wall posts that can be found on Facebook. We also won't get very far if we rely simply on the language of politics. For fuller explanations and insights, we need to examine the deeply political, literary and cultural texts produced by Arab writers and artists. Arab diaspora writers like Ahmed Swaif prompt us to do this. They incorporate the work of Arabic language poets, singers and writers into their English language novels, thereby conveying to their Western readers the long history of resistance in a country like Egypt. Thank you.
Wow, that's fascinating. Thank you, Jemima. Thank you. We're just going to, we've got drinks for afterwards, but I'm sure you've all got questions. I've got a few. So would anyone like to ask a question? Well, I've got one. You go. Okay. I'm fascinated by Al-Aswani actually and the Kubian building, but I'm really interested in the context of what you're talking about with going abroad to be a writer. The other novel of his I read was set in Chicago, and I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but it's about that experience of being abroad, to be an academic and to be a writer, and some of the characters revert to an extreme sort of form of conservatism. I just wondered if that's, in the diaspora fiction, is this something, it's not just about progressive ideas, it's about all aspects of me, of my own life.
It certainly is, and I mean, if I can return to the example of I've spoken in the second novel, The Mark of Love, she does that quite brilliantly, where she looks at, like, I mean, not in any in-depth way, but she has that discussion, and also in the first novel, that change, the sort of, that situation of being confronted by living no longer in your homeland, and having left your homeland where things were, 1970s Egypt was much more secular than 1980s Egypt, for instance. And that kind of transformation also happens in the diaspora for some people, not all the time. Diaspora writers, in my experience, and maybe it's just because it's the ones I've worked on, tend to have progressive views, and many of them, particularly say from the Lebanese tradition, might have left and have been, maybe a conservative Christian, and having gone into the diaspora and being at a distance, away, detached. There's a transformation process that takes place, and some of them, you want to read their novels in that way, but some of them talk about it explicitly in interviews. But I don't think it always has to be that way. Within the diaspora community, you get all kinds of things happening, and in some countries, like this has been sort of researched, I think, in relation to what might be happening with some Arab migrants in places like Germany where they're very marginalised, and this also happens within the Turkish community in Germany where they're very marginalised, and that they might not have come to the country necessarily devout or religious or whatever, but there's a kind of a transformation process as a result of being marginalised or outside of the homeland, trying to reconnect with a culture that makes sense to you. It is documented in the novels, and it certainly is there, and it's critiqued as well in some novels. And Swaif sort of takes it up in the first novel, but again also in her second novel. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
No, let's open more ideas here. Thank you.
Oh, in light of what you've just said, where would you place Awa al-Masri?
I'm not familiar with
Jemana,
that's a question for her.
she's an Australian diaspora,
Oh, okay.
Palestinian.
I can't answer that question. I'm
She's
sorry.
just written a book, Hazem al-Masri's ex-wife.
Yes,
the
yes, no,
footballer,
I'm just,
yeah.
yeah, I'm not sure, like, what do you, sorry, if I can ask you for a bit of clarity on the question.
I meant in the terms of people moving away and becoming either more progressive or less conservative. Where would you place her? Because she's quite conservative in some ways.
She is,
Yeah.
there's an interesting thing that happens with something I've noticed, and, you know, with Hazem al-Masri's wife, for instance, the wife of the gentleman that was detained in Guantanamo Bay for a long time, Abdul Habib's wife as well. You know, they become much more publicly visible and accessible as a result of, you know, the tragedy that befell, you know, a family that had a father and a husband taken away and disappeared and not found for many, many years, and she had to sort of advocate for his return. And same thing, you know, Hazem al-Masri has done a few interviews with his wife that I've also seen. I haven't read the work. I don't know how to, you know, how to sort of make that call. Are they, in some ways there is a kind of moving forward, to use that kind of crude expression, but in other ways there is a situation where they're always defined as, or maybe they're self-defining themselves as women who look after families and stay at home. Not those two women in particular, but just sort of in general thinking about how they might see themselves and what their role is in the private sector, which is the home, and also to write about these things and have a public face as well. I don't think that those categories work easily sometimes to put people in one side or the other. Maybe we should think of it more as a spectrum, and they sit somewhere that's not easily defined.
Thanks, Sharon. Thank you, Jemima. I really enjoyed that. Actually, from what was just asked, I'm curious about the gender politics of this, and also the politics of education. That a lot of these writers are able to write because they're a highly educated transnational elite that can and then reflect back, and how much of their writing is being consumed in their respective homelands, and how useful that is. And that, I mean, the two are kind of linked, because a lot of these female writers have had their education outside, or at a time when Egypt was more secular. And I know you focus on Egypt. I wonder if you could say something about Tunisia, which of course has been francophone and has had a much more peaceful, or apparently more peaceful, transition to an apparent democracy.
Yes. I can't comment.
Sorry, loads of questions.
I can't
It's the politics, the education and gender politics.
I can't comment exactly on the Tunisian experience of Tunisian writers, because I work sort of with the English, people that write in English.
Yeah.
So I haven't paid much attention to the Tunisian writers. Yes, the writers many of them are part of an educated, transnational, have the wealth and the mobility to kind of get out and of the homeland, and Swaif is highly educated, she has a PhD and all those sorts of things. But some of the writers from the Lebanese diaspora, for instance, simply left with their families because they were escaping the war.
Yeah.
And some of them might not have been as transnational and mobile in the same way that Swaif is. So, and for one of the writers I've worked on, Rawi Haj, he writes in English. It's his third language, and so he, you can see the beautiful imperfections in the work. Is what I want to say, because he's not. I sometimes wonder if you know 3 languages, can you master in one of them? Anyway, Swaif's work has been translated. Some of it's been translated into Arabic. Sometimes it's read. Some of it's been, this.
Does she write in English? Does she write? I mean, I've read one quite a lot.
Yeah, she writes
in English.
Interestingly enough, the first work she sat down to write, which was a collection of stories called Aisha. She thought that when she was going to write fiction, she thought she was going to write in Arabic. She sat down to write, and the words wouldn't come to her in Arabic. And several of the writers I work on say this. And for some reason, the literary language for them was English. For her it was obvious because she studied English literature at university and she'd read a lot of novels in English as she was growing up. But it shocked her that she couldn't.
There's a certain distancing that goes on that you acquire if you have the facility to operate in another language, whether it's Arabic or English. That sometimes that can be quite liberating. Because it allows you sometimes to say things that you might not say in your mother tongue or native language.
Or for some reason she said, particularly that first collection of stories, it's very different to anything she's written after that. When she wrote it, even though she wrote it in English, it was targeted for an Arabic, speaking
Readership.
And it's critical in ways that you could imagine this is a conversation that you would have with an Egyptian or an Arab community of people, and not one that you would necessarily. She wasn't conscious of this until after the book. She started to read about the reception of the short stories, and it seemed to, not that she wanted this to happen, the intention of the writer becomes irrelevant once the book goes into a public space, but it seemed to reaffirm some of those Orientalist portrayals of the region that she wasn't happy with. And that's not what the intention was. She was trying to open up a debate. She was thinking maybe these stories would sort of shine a light on some of the, issues to do with gender inequality in the Arab world or in Egypt specifically. But then they were taken up and used as examples of, here's a native, the native informant telling us that our Orientalist understanding of the region is true. And she was very bothered by that, but she was bothered by it years later when she looked back and saw how it was received. And she talks about this explicitly in an interview with an academic called Joseph Massad. And that when she realised that all of her writing was going to happen in English, it had an effect on how she started to craft her stories.
I can understand that.
Just an addition to the stories, she is very widely known in Egypt, and although she writes in English, as I mentioned, this translation in Arabic, she does give a completely different perspective from what's inside, but we do not tend to completely dismiss what she said just because she lived abroad, and her family, I think the major part of her family still lives in Egypt, and they're quite active on the ground, and she, in her writings, states their opinions, and she's constantly in conversation with them. So it's a kind of ongoing dialogue between people writing from the outside and people writing from the inside, which is very, very enriching.
Sort of follow-up question to that. Thank you for the paper and all the different links you made. I also have another question about sort of the Australia, I'm going to just ask a follow-up question first. Was just thinking about this work, I'm really interested in the sort of cultural translator or liaison figure that you're talking about, the diaspora writer occupying in particular. And I'm just wondering, in terms of what you just said about class position, or sort of reflecting on the writers that do occupy a transnational elite position, but then bearing in mind that that's not universal, that there are also diaspora writers who don't necessarily come from that kind of background. I just wonder if you could, do you think it's possible to generalize and say that the people who take up the sort of explicit, quite didactic, I think, in the passage here from my son in particular, kind of role that Zoe takes up, does that come in the transnational elite more, do you think? Do you think you can generalize about a different kind of liaison role that's happening depending on where the person's coming from?
It's a really good question. Thanks for asking a hard question now.
I reflect out loud.
Most novels by Arab diaspora writers. I haven't read all of them, but 90% of what I've read always have to contain some kind of Arabic word somewhere in the sentence. Another UK writer who hasn't written in a long time, Tony Hanania, in one of his novels, Unreal City, Homesick as well, he's very cheeky because the text doesn't even italicize the Arabic word, it's just in there. It doesn't tell you what it means, you've got to work it out. And I know what it means. Interestingly enough, when I read his works in English, I don't hear them in Arabic in the way that I hear Swaif's works in Arabic when I read them. Rawi Haj does the same thing in the first novel, De Niro's Game, but he gives you a glossary at the end so he can tell you what all words mean. So most of them do contain some kind of Arabic words, but nobody does it in my readings to the level of sophistication that Mrs. Swaif is doing it. And one of the reasons might be, and I hate to sort of bring the writer back in, but I think it's because she's got this, interesting training in linguistics, and she understands how the Arabic language operates at a sophisticated level. Many people, the way that we can all speak and read and write in English, but we might not necessarily know how the grammar itself always operates. So she's got a level of understanding that maybe some of the other writers don't necessarily have. She's particular, and that's why I read In the Eye of the Sun so long ago. I dare not say how old I was. And then I read The Map of Love as soon as it came out, and I was really struck by the passage, both of those passages for years. I just kept on coming back to them. Yeah, and printed them out and looked at them and looked at them and looked at them, and something sparked in 2011. Just something that came to life for me. And as I was watching the scenes unfold in Tahrir Square, those were the passages that I kept on thinking about and kept on remembering. But no other writer came to mind in the way that she did for any of the other sort of scenes of uprisings. So there is something particular about her. Yeah.
Can I ask my other question? My other question was, an Australia postcolonial studies question, so it's a completely different question. But I was struck, I know this, but I guess I never quite thought about it in the way when you were framing it. The point about Commonwealth literary studies, and in some ways postcolonial literary studies really being, coming out of Australia, sort of Empire Writes Back being extraordinarily influential and coming out of Australia. And I'm interested in the kind of, at least here, at least the way postcolonial studies is thought about in this country, and I think probably also in North American context, the sort of weird centrality then, but then also invisibility of Australia. People talk about, the postcolonial framework. I don't know if they're always thinking about an Australian kind of perspective. And I was wondering if that weird kind of relationship of Australia to the field has also bears on what you're saying about Australian Middle East studies at all.
I don't know how to make this the link to sort of Australian Middle East studies, but there is certainly a tension there amongst the few people that we have in Australia that do, on the one hand, postcolonial literature, and then some people who see themselves as, people who have worked on Australian literature.
Right.
And the postcolonial group might just sort of think that Australian literature is simply a branch of postcolonial literature. I think it can be framed and analysed in that way, but for the Australianists, it's Australian literature, it's not just a branch of post-colonial literature. But I don't know how that might tie in with the treatment in Australia of, the lack of Middle East literatures. I think that there is, when you go to do work on African literature or, literature from, any other sort of Southeast Asian country or whatever, you want to know the historical context, you want to know, how to place the work. And maybe there is a fear of how do we make sense, how do we wrap our head around this Middle East that doesn't want to stay still. I know I'm always anxious. I was anxious giving this paper because I know that the situation in Egypt has changed so much between now and 2011. It's a region that refuses to sit down and be still and make my life easier at the beginning of every semester when I have to get my courses ready. Constantly rewriting lectures. Names are changing often enough, and how does one make sense even of, say, how does one make sense of Syria? How do we know exactly what's going on? We don't even know all the characters at play. We don't know, it's going to take years before we can reflect back and really make sense of of what's going on. The Lebanese Civil War finished in 1989, and there's still books coming out day after, year after year on the, war and memory in post, and the Lebanese Civil War. We're still trying to make sense of that conflict. So yeah, it's difficult to want to talk with any kind of authority on the literature that's being produced by some writers of that region, and not feeling like you can comfortably take hold of or understand the history of the region. And as I said, I pointed these out in the paper, it doesn't necessarily lend itself to be thought of easily in a post-colonial frame. A lot of the literature is written in Arabic. We don't want to deal with literatures in translations. There's kind of that, I can see those are the reasons why people don't also take it on. I want us to get over the anxiety of translation and dealing with text in translation. And that's not to say that you just pretend that there wasn't an original language that it was written. You frame it as part of the discussion. And most people in the English-speaking West are reading these books if they are reading, they're reading them in translation. So why don't we kind of embrace what's going on here and make that a framework within which to have that discussion? That's going to be just me and wanting to bring more literature into what we do. And I would really strongly desire that people that do Middle East studies everywhere, not just in Australia, but Australia's the context that I work in, not have a problem with, if people are doing work on Africa, they will read Conrad's Heart of Darkness. And yes, they'll set that on a politics course, but they won't, setting a novel in a Middle East studies course is like, why would you do that?
But why wouldn't you do that?
Well, that's my question. Why wouldn't you do that?
It's easy, it's such a...
And I was toying with the idea of this year actually giving the students a whole novel to read about, the Lebanese Civil War, and I thought I was going to pick a fun one, and I thought, no, it's not going to be fun, and, I just...
graphic novel.
I have a large,
And do you show films?
Sometimes I show films, yeah.
Because
Yeah,
film could be really useful.
Films can be good. Trying to get the students to come to 2 hours before a lecture to watch a film sometimes can be a bit tricky, but I've told them to watch particular films, and then they talk to me about how the film wasn't historically accurate. I go, but we're not, film isn't the replacement for the textbook. Sorry.
I just want to go back to a point about how if the political context is so constantly shifting and changing, does that reflect in the aesthetics of the fiction in terms of narrative style or fragmented narrative? I'm just curious. How do these writers face that challenge in terms of change?
Writers have spoken about this and saying we need new ways and new models and new structures, literary structures in which to convey what's going on in the region. Ada Swaif has spoken, she hasn't written fiction in a long time. She's finding herself without time to write, but also unable to write. And she's spoken about, writers sometimes need the time to think about what they want to write and how they're going to write it. For her it's about coming up, not just with time, but with a kind of framework that will work with what she wants to say in her third novel, which I believe goes back to ancient Egypt.
That's right, it goes back to ancient Egypt.
Yeah.
She says she knows it, but she hasn't put it on paper. She hasn't. Yeah.
I wanted to put it on paper because it's been a while.
Well, lots of people have asked her, particularly her friend Hisham Mata.
Yes.
Yeah, so if he can't get it out of her, I don't know what's going to happen.
He's another remarkable writer, I think.
He's fantastic.
Yeah. He's written an essay a while ago, a few years ago now, for the New Yorker. I can't remember the title, but please go and find it. It's so amazing. He's talking about going back to Libya to find his father, and he was working in New York at the time at Barnard College. And the way that he brings New York together with his, his recollections of Libya and going back, it's just really, really special writing. I want to set that particular essay for my students to show them what beautiful writing looks like.
I think we've got one more question. Or is that you, Rory? Oh, 2 more questions, and then we have to.
Should have just one comment.
Just a short question. I was quite interested when you were mentioning, Jemana, about the lack of Middle East studies in Australian universities. And then I was thinking, because my undergraduate was in modern European studies at Monash, and then there's like a Russian centre and like, you know, Southeast Asian centres, which they do, it seems, memory serves me correctly, so have courses on literature, economics, geography, and all these different things. Do you think now, because of what's been happening in the Middle East, that there might be a more proliferation of Middle East centres in Australian unis, or is it going to get more diverse? Do you know what I mean? Is they going to teach things like this and the film and the other things as well?
You would think that it would. You would really hope that it would. I see, you know, I mean, there are some, say, another institution I didn't mention, which was Deakin, which has also Middle East studies, but again, I think it's very much dominated by politics and a bit of history as well. I would like to think that it would. For instance, in the department I work in at Macquarie University, I'm the only person that teaches in the Middle East studies or politics stuff. There was a push, and a person was hired as a second person. This is before I sort of took over the unit. And when the second person was hired, the person that was already in place, thinking that he was going to be working with someone else, he died suddenly. And so he was never replaced, and the second person came, and then he left very quickly, which is how I sort of ended up doing the unit as well. But there is no active effort, I think, for expansion, unless maybe some rich oil sheikh comes along and says, take this money, and we say no thank you, because we are not going to do that, we don't want to write reports that make out as if you're fantastic. No, I mean, I can't say, and I wish it would, because I think it's I outlined at the beginning, and this is just sort of one example, I mean, I could give, Australia has been involved in the region for a very long time.
Yeah. And it's increasing as well. I was just talking with a colleague over here that I've got an Egyptian brother-in-law, and there's an increasing amount of immigration from the Middle East to Australia, and it's, when I was living in Dubai, there was lots and lots of people wanting to go to Australia, so I just thought all of these factors.
And there's some really interesting work going on. Where does the Hajj work?
Well, Sam, he's based at the University of Melbourne.
But he's coming at it from a very different place, but a deeply culturally informed place.
Yeah. His work is based in anthropology, but he informs people across so many disciplines, and he talks about sort of Australian society and the version of multiculturalism, but he can also talk about stuff that goes on amongst Arab communities within the country and beyond.
Sama Habib, who was at University of Technology in Sydney, she's written a book, but she was involved, but she wasn't really. What was her section there? What was her leaning in that? Although she's not working there anymore, she left in a very controversial way.
Was it UTS or was she at UWS? I can't remember.
Because she has written there. She's written a book as well as
she's written several substantial pieces of work. I can't remember what area she's in. If she was in cultural studies or if she was in gender studies or so. I can't remember, to be honest.
One last question. Thank you for that enlightening discussion. I have a comment and a question. My comment was that Megan Knapp, the Kuwaiti writer, whose book, The Hidden Light of Objects, just won the Edinburgh Book Festival Award, also writes in English, though she lives in Kuwait, and Arabic is her first language. And when they asked her why she wrote the book in English instead of Arabic, she said, because that's how I think. It just came out, so that's kind of like super. But that was, that was the number one question everyone was asking her. Why are you writing it in English? And my question is, where do Iraqi writers play in this discussion, pre-Saddam and post-Saddam, especially those in the diaspora?
It's a good question. I'm moving through the Arab world very slowly, of course. I haven't reached the Iraqi writers yet, so I can't answer the question yet, unfortunately. But I'm kind of dying to get there because I'm compiling my lists and to see where I want to go with this. So unfortunately, I really can't make any good statement about where Iraqi writers fit in this. But I understand in the Australian scene that there's a lot of unpublished, like not formally published work by Iraqi poets, exiles, who are writing poetry and creative work, who might not have seen themselves as poets, say, before they left Iraq, but as a result of the process of exile or migration or whatever, and the not so pleasant way that we tend to treat people that seek refuge when they come to Australia, if they come by a boat. You know, that process in itself has produced some kind of creative work from them, and it has been performed in some places, and I've, you know, heard about them, not necessarily gone to see them, but, you know, if you come and ask me that question, maybe in a year's time I have a better answer for you, I'm sorry.
Well, I think we can continue this discussion all night, but perhaps over a few drinks next door. Please join me in thanking Jemana for